Welcome back, and thank you for slipping into the Firelight again, if only for a moment. Settle in and come with me to North Carolina, Christmas Day, 1929, where frost stitched silver on tobacco fields, church bells floated over red ribbons and evergreen, and the hymn of Silent Night drifted like breath in the cold. But in one farmhouse, quiet beneath holiday boughs and boughs, a father was stoking something darker, giving new meaning to a silent night. North Carolina, Stokes County. The hills rolled low and familiar, stitched with rows of tobacco cut back for winter, barns breathing out the faint sweet ghost of last summer's cure. A red dirt road ran past a modest farmhouse, where the windows wore lace and the porch boards creaked with the memory of boots. In that house, on Christmas week of 1929, lived the Lawsons, a tenant farming family with calloused hands and Sunday bests hung just behind the door. The cold that year felt honest clean, bright and thin as church glass. Wood smoke feathered from chimneys. Neighbors swapped pies, hymns, and news across fences, and the stores in Winston-Salem glittered like small cities to country eyes. Out here, the holidays were not tinsel, they were ritual. Oranges in a bowl, a new ribbon, a string of popcorn, a hymn carried home on the breath. The patriarch was Charles Davis Lawson. Charlie, they called him. 30-something and stone-shouldered from seasons in the rows. His wife, Fanny, kept the home steady, hands quiet and capable, voice soft as quilt batting. Their children filled the rooms the way laughter fills a kitchen on baking day. Marie, 17, with her hair pinned just so. Arthur, 16, already working a man's hours. Carrie, 12, quick-footed and bright. And Maybelle, 7, a spark in calico. James, 4, who ran more than he walked. Raymond, 2, round-cheeked and curious. And the baby, Mary Lou, near enough to the angels that her breath still sounded like a secret. They were not a family of abundance. Tenant farming rarely allows such luxury. But they were a family with rhythm. Seed time, weed time, harvest time, chapel time. The days linked hands and made a chain. In early December, Charlie did something uncommon. He took the family to town, to a photographer's studio. New hats, new coats, shoes polished until the leather shone like puddles after rain. They stood for the lens, solemn, careful, almost regal in their stiffness, while the photographer adjusted light and focus, and the babies were coaxed to stillness. Neighbors noticed. Tenant farmers didn't often spring for studio portraits, not in lean winters. But there it was, a photograph to mark a season, to freeze the Lawsons in their Sunday best, as if the moment itself were a kind of prayer. Some would later lean over that picture and search it for warnings, as though the emulsion might have trapped a shadow, as though grief prints clues in silver and salt before it steps through the door. But photographs are faithful to faces, not to futures. The picture showed what it showed, a family trying to look their finest. But sometimes the finest is marred, and others see and whisper, most staying quieter than the floorboards, others echoing like a shout in a well. The Lawson neighbors whispered of a head injury Charlie had taken months before, an accident with a tool, the sort of thing a working man shakes off because the rows won't wait. Others traded darker rumors in kitchens where coffee went cold, that something in the family was wrong in a way that faces don't reveal, that Marie seemed pale with a secret her lips never spoke, of a father's love for a daughter turning the wrong color in the dark, and that a house can carry the pain of words no one dares say aloud. You will hear many versions. You will be told he was changed, that headaches came like storms, that his temper found more edge than it used to. We will not embroider. We will only say this. By Christmas week, unease had taken a chair at the Lawson table, and no one dared to ask it its name. On Christmas Eve, the fields wore frost like lace. Fanny moved the iron pots from stove to table and tucked the baby into crook and blanket. Marie hummed just a thread of tune while she pinned a ribbon. Arthur checked traps, fetched wood and measured the cut of the day by the ache in his shoulders. Carrie and Maybelle whispered plans for the morning. Whose gifts would be opened first, whether oranges taste sweeter when peeled beside a tree. Charlie kept to himself more than most days. A man turned inward, like a barn door half latched against the wind. He had been to town again. He had shells in his pocket and quiet in his jaw. When he looked at his family, he looked long, as if trying to memorize a poem he had written but could no longer quite recall. Christmas morning did not rush. It simply arrived, clean as a new page. The small ones stirred first, little feet whispering over the boards, their breath silvering the window, their hands already wanting to touch what was wrapped. Fanny's voice gathered them. Mary adjusted a bow. Carrie smoothed her skirt and laughed that laugh that makes other people laugh for no good reason. The kettle sang. The stove ticked. The house smelled of coffee, cinnamon, and wood smoke. A plan was set, as simple as a path through snow. Carrie and Maybelle would walk ahead to their aunt and uncle's place to wish a Merry Christmas before dinner. Arthur would check on chores. The others would ready the table. Mundane choices, the small turns by which fate does its greatest work. Charlie stood on the porch with the winter light laid cold across his knuckles. He watched the girls pull on mittens, watched their cheeks bloom with the outdoors. He told Arthur to run an errand into town, something a father says when he trusts a son, or when he needs to move a piece quietly on a board only he is studying. Arthur nodded and set off along the road, the brim of his cap taking the frost like sugar. Carrie and Maybelle skipped the first few yards, then settled into a walk, the way children do when the world is bigger than their legs and the day is bigger than their pockets. Behind them, the house breathed and ticked. A man on a porch put his hands in his coat. Carrie's scarf was a bright thread against the pale morning, and Maybelle's mittens clapped little rhythms into the cold. The path toward their aunt and uncle's place cut along the edge of the field, past a slat fence that leaned like an old man listening, and then slipped between a windbreak of cedar and pine. Their breath rose ahead of them like soft banners. The sun sat low but honest. The day felt trustworthy. They spoke in the shorthand of sisters, half words and quick looks. Which pie Aunt here had made, whether the baby would grab the ribbon again, if Arthur, newly tall, would carve the meat like their father did. The topics drifted and braided, as easy as the sound of their shoes over frost, as easy as the way one hand found the other without having to ask. Behind them, the house shrank in the distance until it was only a square of roof against the trees, the chimney a small, careful line in the sky. At the edge of the woodlot sat an old tobacco shed, grey boards, door tilted, a place that had known the heat of summer curing and the quiet of 100 mornings just like this one. Beside it, the earth dimpled with wagon ruts gone stiff with frost. Crows kept a watch from the far fence, their black coats shining as if dipped in ink. There are places where the world seems to hold its breath, where sound is thinner, where light feels less certain. The backside of that shed was such a place, just a step out of sight from the path, just to turn away from the view of the fields. You could stand there and watch the road without being seen. Count footsteps, measure distances, fold time in your hands and make it wait. A man stood there now, still as a fence post, winter light flattened on his cheek, breath shallow in the cold. He knew this yardage, he knew this hour, he knew the pattern of his daughter's days the way a farmer knows the stubbornness of a row. In his pocket, shells that whispered against one another like beads. Across his shoulder, familiar weight that had, until now, belonged only for rabbits and crows. In winter, sound carries a long way and then stops all at once. The first report cracked the morning like ice, and the crows startled up in a ragged lift. The second came a breath behind it, the echo rolling into the trees and dying there. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. There is a way the heart wants to soften even the hardest acts, to believe that after a terrible choice, some small tenderness remains. What we know is this: he drew near where they lay, brushed away what the ground might keep as a trace. He crossed their arms as if arranging sleep. He placed a small thing, something cherished, near a small hand. A father's gestures travel with him, even when they have lost their compass. And the wind does not testify. If you stood there minutes later, you would have found only the ordinary winter, the dull shine of frozen grass, the flat board of the shed, a bird's claw stitched briefly into the surface of the frost. The air would have smelled of leaf and cedar, and the faintest tang of powder already fading. The path would still lead forward. The world is not a house of accusers. It does not keep a ledger in the sky. It absorbs. It continues. The sun lifts another notch, and the fence takes the weight of a crow, and then lets it go. Arthur by then had reached the edge of town, the brim of his cap carrying a sugared crust of cold. He felt only the decent ache of a young man doing what his father asked, walking with purpose, checking the list in his head, calculating the return before dinner. He did not know that fate had placed him on a different board than the rest, that an errand had become a shield. Back at the house, Fanny shook a cloth over the porch rail and laughed softly at the way the baby kicked at the emptiness as though it were a game. Marie tied an apron. The smaller boys circled and crossed like pond linnows, always near, always elsewhere, falling into and out of the day's work with the grace of children who have learned the geometry of a mother's kitchen. The door opened and closed on ordinary sounds. The clock said nothing of what it knew. From the woodlot, a single set of prints led back toward the house. Clean ovals in the frost, each one a decision. The path curved along the fence, crossed the yard at the angle a man uses when he does not wish to be seen from a window. He paused at the corner where the clapboard throws a long shadow even at noon in winter. He looked once, long, slow, at the porch where a rug lay over the rail and a kettle ghosted the air with its small, steadfast steam. Inside a chair scraped, a spoon touched crockery. Someone sang a line and left the rest alone. The Lawson porch was scrubbed clean, the boards pale and honest. A bough of pine had been wired to the rail, the needles fragrant where a hand had crushed them, the red ribbon faded to a brownish wine. The latch had the shine that comes from years of use. The leather of his glove creaked, the hinge answered with its small, old iron confession. The door parted, inches only, and the warm air of the kitchen came to meet the cold and wrestled it to a drawer in the gap. Behind him, the winter field waited as fields do, offering no counsel and no complaint. Ahead of him, the room he knew better than any other opened its hands. Houses do not accuse, they keep, they receive. They turn every footfall into memory and store it inside the grain of their beams. If a chair tips, they remember the arc. If a spoon clinks, they keep the note long after ears have forgotten it. If a father's heart grows colder in the morning, the house makes space for that too and holds it without speech. The baby cooed, the kettle sighed, the dog under the table arranged his legs and made a circle of himself just so. The clock found its mark and laid another second down beside the others. The door, newly shut, sealed winter out and everything else in. The Lawson kitchen was the kind of room that made a man's bones remember comfort. Wood stove ticking low, the scent of cloves and ham braided with pine from the boughs over the mantel. The windows, edged in lace, were white with the breath of the house, catching the pale light in a softened haze. On the table, a pie cooled beneath a square of muslin, and the baby's rattle lay abandoned beside it. Fanny moved between stove and table with the easy rhythm of a woman whose hands had been trained by need and habit. Marie, her eldest daughter, brushed flour from her palms and fetched plates from the cupboard. The younger boys, James and Raymond, skated in and out of the doorway like the cold wind itself, each time carrying in a gust of air and the sound of the barn beyond. Nothing yet had happened that would trouble the day's memory. In that moment, Christmas still belonged to them. The shift was almost imperceptible, a new shadow on the porch, a hinge catching and releasing in a way that made the dog lift its head, the sound of boots crossing the threshold, deliberate, unhurried, a father's voice quiet enough to keep the children from stilling mid-play. He was just home from the woodlot, perhaps, no reason to startle, and yet the room seemed to pull inward, the warmth folding around a presence that was heavier than the cold he had carried in. His coat still smelled faintly of the shed, of cedar and dust. He stood for a moment in the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room, his eyes moving across them as though counting. 1, 2, 3. It happened before thought had the chance to form. The shotgun, an extension of his body, rose into the narrow air between stove and table. The blast cracked the plaster's patience, turned the scent of cloves into something acrid. Fanny fell where she stood, her apron folding over itself as she sank, a single breath escaping like a word forgotten halfway through. Marie, eyes wide with the uncomprehending shock of it, turned toward him. Her mouth began the shape of a question, but the answer came too fast. Another shot cleaving the room's rhythm in two. The table trembled under the weight of the echo. James froze where his feet had carried him, a tin soldier suddenly remembering he was only flesh. Raymond's voice was the smallest thing in the room, and it did not last. It is difficult to speak of the moments that follow such violence, how a home becomes unmade in the space of seconds, how the air itself seems altered. The kitchen, once an engine of life, now bore stillness like a heavy quilt. The baby stirred in its crib, confused by the sudden absence of familiar sounds, then began to cry, small, steady, insistent. He moved toward it with a slowness that was almost gentle. The rattle once bright in the child's hand was taken and set aside. The crying ceased as if the air had been cut. In the sitting room, the clock struck 1:15, oblivious. Outside, a crow landed on the porch rail and studied the frost along the boards. No neighbors stood at the windows then. No one had yet heard enough to cross the snowy yards between farms. The barn cat, curled in the hay, heard the door shut and thought only of the wind's reach. The crows in the field saw movement, the kind they did not trust, and lifted in a black flutter to the far fence. Inside, the quiet was the kind that seals itself to the skin. A chair rocked faintly from where a body had brushed it in falling, the motion slowing until it stopped.
There are details in this story that survive because someone, somewhere, thought them worth remembering. how he crossed each arm over the chest, how he straightened a skirt, how he laid the youngest down with care beside its mother. It is said that he moved through the rooms with the composure of a man setting things in order for company, though the company he expected was not of this world. Some objects remained untouched. A plate of biscuits, a child's drawing tacked to the wall, a scarf looped over the back of a chair. It is possible he could not bring himself to disturb them. Or perhaps they had already lost meaning. When the work was done, or what he had chosen to call done, he stepped out into the brittle air. His boots marked the snow in dark, sharp ovals. The barn door groaned in its hinges as he pushed it open. Inside, the smell of hay and animals was almost sweet after the air in the house. In the loft, the hay lay thick and warm from the breath of the mules. He found a place where the boards creaked less, where the light from the small square window could fall across him without glare. He had carried one last shell in his pocket. The weight of it had been a steady companion all morning. The shot was not as loud in the barn, the hay absorbing the sharpest edge of it. Still, the crows startled again, circling once before settling. The dog barked twice, then fell silent. In the house, nothing stirred. And so the farmhouse sat, with its table set for a holiday meal that would never be eaten, with the pie cooling under its muslin veil, with the gifts still tucked beneath the tree. Time began to pass differently then. Minutes were heavier. The light shifted with more reluctance. A stillness settled over the farm so deep that when the first neighbor finally stepped onto the porch, they paused before knocking, uncertain if anyone was within. It is said that news moves like wind in a rural place, fast, with invisible hands pushing it from one house to the next. The first who found them carried the weight of that scene in their eyes for the rest of their lives. They did not linger, they went for the sheriff. By the time lawmen arrived, the frost had softened in the afternoon sun, but the prints remained, leading from house to barn like a map drawn by grief. Inside, the rooms were as they had been left. The only change was the presence of strangers who spoke in low tones, who averted their gaze when stepping over a threshold. And in the barn, they found the man at the center of it all, the last breath of the morning still lingering faintly in the loft air. In Stokes County, word traveled faster than the river's winter current. By the time the sheriff's car rolled back into town, the story had already beaten him there, carried in fragments down dirt roads, traded in murmurs over store counters, and wrapped in the disbelief that such a thing could happen here. "Lawson's gone and done something terrible," someone whispered on Main Street. But no one could yet imagine the shape of it. By nightfall, lantern light glowed from every kitchen window in town, the air thick with the low hum of speculation. Neighbors spoke in circles about the farm, the family, the Christmas just hours old, each sentence trailing off into the same stunned silence. The next morning, the press descended like crows to fresh seed. Reporters from Winston-Salem, then from farther afield, Greensboro, Raleigh, even Richmond, poured into the hills, their notebooks eager to catch every grim syllable. Headlines bloomed like frost on glass. Family of 7 slain on Christmas Day. Farmer takes own life after killing wife, children. The photographs were the kind that lived too long in memory. Black and white images of the farmhouse, its porch shadowed in grief. The barn, its loft window a square of quiet accusation. The rows of gathered townsfolk, faces pinched by both cold and the weight of what they'd seen. It took place 2 days later, under a sky the color of pewter.
7 coffins stood in a row, 6 small, 1 larger, each draped in simple white flowers. The ground was hard, and the gravediggers' shovels rang against the frozen earth like neutered bells. The crowd was so large it spilled beyond the churchyard fence. Strangers pressed shoulder to shoulder with kin. There was no shortage of prayers, but the words felt small against the scale of the loss. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men kept their hats in their hands longer than was necessary, as though bare heads might signal a deeper respect. When the last hymn faded, the only sound was the wind combing through the bare branches, as if nature itself was trying to soften the scene. Theories multiplied in the weeks that followed, each one a thread too thin to bear the whole weight. Some said it was money troubles. Others blamed a head injury from a farm accident years before, claiming it had changed his temper. There were whispers of darker things, family secrets no one dared voice above a murmur. What the truth was, no one could pin down. Charles Lawson had left no note, no explanation, only the trail of his boots in the snow and the bodies of those he'd vowed to protect. In the absence of certainty, the story began to take on its own life, each retelling bending a little, reshaping itself to fit the teller's tone. In spring, the farm changed hands, but it never lost its shadow. Travelers spoke of a heaviness in the air as they passed. Some swore they saw figures at the upstairs window when the place was meant to be empty. Others claimed the sound of a baby's cry drifted from the barn on still nights. By summer, curiosity seekers were arriving from as far as Tennessee and Virginia, their car tires kicking up dust on the narrow road. They wanted to see the house where Christmas had turned to ash. They wanted to walk in the footsteps of the dead, to stand where a father had stood and try to make sense of it. The farm, they said, did not give up its answers.
Years passed. The Lawsons became less a family in the minds of the public and more a cautionary tale. A campfire story with edges worn smooth from use. New details sprouted, some true, others grown from the fertile ground of imagination. In certain retellings, Charles was a man haunted before that winter morning, his eyes carrying storms no one else could see. In others, he was a doting father struck suddenly mad, the violence as inexplicable as lightning from a clear sky. What never changed was the ending, the woodlot, the walk to the barn, the final echo of the shotgun in the loft. The yellowing clippings still sit in county archives, ink faded, photographs ghostly in their loss of contrast. The handwriting in the sheriff's logbook is steady, almost too neat for the subject it records. Some of the original witnesses are long gone now, their memories, once sharp, have thinned like old cloth. But in those rare moments when they speak of it, the air in the room still seems to shift, as though the story carries its own weather. Every December, as frost silvered the fields again, someone in Stokes County would bring it up, not always by name, sometimes just a phrase. That was the year of the Lawson Christmas, they whisper. It became part of the county's darker inheritance, a reminder that tragedy can come dressed in familiar clothes, can walk in through the front door as if it belongs there. And always, in the telling, the farmhouse stood there still, its windows catching the low winter sun, its porch empty, its rooms forever holding that moment when the season's joy curdled into silence. The story, like the frost, does not stay gone. It returns year after year in quiet voices and yellowed pages, in the way people glance toward that stretch of road without meaning to. It is not the kind of thing you forget. For those who carry it, Christmas always has two faces, the one lit by candlelight and laughter, and the one shadowed by the memory of a family whose holiday ended in the sound of a gun, the creak of rope, and the slow turning of a world that did not stop, no matter how much it should have. Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you go, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, stay warm, stay curious, and stay safe.